Hi, we are here today with our friend Meghan Riordan Jarvis and are going to have a great discussion on a very important topic on what happens to your body physically and otherwise through grief. And it's an important subject. If you're not ready to have that conversation yet, feel free to come back when you are. But one thing we'd like to encourage you to do is maybe share this with somebody that's in your close circle of trust that may know you well. This information can be helpful to them as they help you. So the next question, or I guess physical symptom that I want to talk to, and it might be two parts, but is the symptoms of being afraid and anxious after loss. Wondering if you could kind of speak to that.
I love this question. Language really helps us understand our experience, and being able to say that afraid and anxious are different words is important. So afraid, when you are afraid inside your body, you are reacting to something that is a stimulus. It's in the present moment. And I think if we asked folks, what does it feel like to feel afraid, you could probably even bring up some of that tension in the chest and tension in the stomach and maybe jaw. And fear is really important. For us to be afraid is how we have evolved and survived and stayed alive. Now, anxiety is a different mechanism. So if we go back to thinking about the left and the right side of the brain, anxiety is an overactive amygdala that is almost like keeping the heat on, even though it's gotten hot outside. So the amygdala is conditioned. Sometimes it's from childhood, sometimes it's because the stress of watching your loved one die from cancer. It's been years, but it's conditioned to code information and seek information without kind of ever resetting. So the amygdala is like that little soldier outside the queen's castle in the red, just going back and forth, never resting. And that adds that generation, the amygdala being overactive, is the first step to a whole system response of being on what we call a hypervigilant alert. And anxiety is when that is your condition most of the time. It's important for people to know that anxiety can run in families, that there's something called, transgenerational trauma. We hand down some of the bad things that have happened to us in our DNA. That's epigenetics. So if you come from a family that has experienced anxiety, that's a good enough reason to go talk to, even start with your primary care physician. I can't sleep, I can't rest, I can't relax, and I'm worried that it may be anxiety that is now set up shop inside my system.
I wanted to talk about the afraid part and the fear side of it, and I'm glad that we've clarified that they are two separate emotions. What are the more common fears that people maybe have after death?
So one thing that people talk about all the time is that once there has been particularly a sudden loss or the loss of someone very primary to you, you will develop all kinds of fears of that happening to everyone else you've ever met. And what that looks like, and we grievers will talk about this sort of, almost like it's part of our culture and part of our language. But for me, what that looks like is if I'm supposed to meet you at 12 and you are not there at 12:15 and you have not texted me, I am dress rehearsing your funeral in my mind. Because I have lived through a sudden experience. It's not irrational. I've lived through sudden loss, and so my brain is saying this template of sudden loss that we experienced before may apply right now. So the anxiety that we can twist into is when that activates my physical system and I'm on a state of alert. I wasn't there. I just had these fears.
as it relates to the feeling of being afraid, I just wanted to ask a very specific one that I hear often, and I experienced it, but my dad was 46 when he died. I'm approaching that age. There are a lot of people that often say that they're afraid that they will die before or at the time maybe their loved one passed away. That specific fear, I wondered if you could maybe just address what's going on when people feel that emotion.
I'm so glad you asked that question. That does come up, and often similar to things like anniversaries, and people have feeling about it, but they don't even realize the anniversary is coming. People don't realize that they are bracing for that hitting the age that their parent was or their brother was, and again, it goes back to the brain is a predictive tool. So it has no way of predicting what it would be like to be a dad who is over the age of 45. And so it is actually bracing for calamity in that moment, whether you're conscious of it or not. And there are some really famous examples. Anderson Cooper didn't get married or have children until after he was the age of his dad. I think that's right. So I think that is, the brain doesn't know how to imagine your life past that date when you are looking at particularly your same-sex parent who did not live past that date.
So yeah, it's really interesting. My grandfather died at 36, 37. My dad was 46. And so for me, I look at that generational pattern and I go, well, there's no men in my family that have lived past this age. So I guess my question is, since this is a common fear that exists with people that have especially lost parents, is there anything we can do about that?
Well, first, I think talking about it and allowing people to know that that's a normal experience, and that many, many other grievers also, the wisdom of their body and brain have also had this fear. There are some ways in which we take from grief theories. There's one called continuing bonds, which is this idea that even though your person's died physically, that you are continuing to have a relationship with them for the rest of your life. And it's not actually really about their memory. It's about you living forward and staying connected to them. So there's a lovely rabbi whose name is Steve Leder, who talks about seeing the world with your eyes for them. So when I'm working with grievers one-on-one, I ask them to imagine how their dad would have been as a grandfather. What do they know to be true? And if they can't answer that, which sometimes, what do they wish would be true? And so now what we're doing with our imagination, which is pretty amazing, is taking our memories from the past and predicting forward. Something that's not going to happen, but we wish would happen. And then all of a sudden, you are moving past the death. And that, in trauma, sometimes when people can't think of anything other than how their dad looked or their partner or whomever the day they died, they're stuck. That's an indication that maybe that memory can't move forward for you. But when you're talking about, I was a young person, I am now the age my dad was when he died, what would it look like forward? We can use our imaginations.
Awesome. The next physical symptom I want to address is that how should someone handle fluctuations in hunger specifically?
So the body, when it goes into that really reactive state, when the limbic system activates because it is telling you you are in danger, it does this incredible thing, which is it rushes all the blood to the vital organs. And so people will say they felt cold in their arms. Yeah, because the blood actually was running to your heart and your lungs and your viscera to keep you alive, as if you were about to be torn apart by a bear. And those missent messages around hunger and satiation can become very cyclic for people. What's important about hunger is to know yourself and your body historically. Food is a complicated thing for people. And so for some people, maybe like you, eating a pint of ice cream for a little while isn't going to have terrible ramifications. But if you have a history with eating disorders, even though you might not be hungry, you want to be checking in with people who have given you advice around disordered eating. Typically, we want to be doing nutrient-dense food even if you're not hungry. For a lot of people, when they go through that window of tolerance where they suddenly don't feel even, hunger either drops away or they find themselves overly hungry. And again, if you know that historically you can do damage, either not eating enough or eating too much, we want to take that history into the fact that your body is sending miscues around hunger. If you know what, sometimes I emotionally eat a little bit, it doesn't tend to really have drastic, then just trust the wisdom.
And I love that you also brought up again, look to your support system, those that know you. If things feel off, if they know that you've had a struggle with this or history of it, or your family has, etc., those can be kind of some signals. Because when you're in that fog, you don't really see what's going on. Sometimes those people that are on the periphery that can really help point that out. So I love that you brought that again to our attention. The next physical symptom I'd love to address is just illness specifically. People can often describe that they feel ill from grief specifically, and that's their correlation, or they may see that their immune system becomes compromised. Wondering if you can address that specifically, of just illness and immunity and that side of our health.
Yeah, and what I would add to that also is somatic pain, that people will discover that their body is showing its tension, headaches, pain in the back, lower back, stomach aches, sore throats. So again, because our body and our mind are connected, it actually makes sense that if we are going through something that is registering as stress, if I said, John, you're going to walk for the next 48 hours, that's a lot of stress to put on your body. Now you're doing that through walking, and so maybe we would expect your feet to hurt and we might expect your knees to hurt. There is a lot of stress on the physical system when you're grieving. And most of it, as we've been talking about, is not fully well known by people. Some of what happens to people's systems when they are discovering illness is it's not happening in the moment that they are considering themselves grieving. And this is important. When you are in a traumatic situation, your body is guarding against what's happening to you right now. So it's flooding you with adrenaline and it's, the neurotransmitters of protection. When you are no longer in danger, when your body and your mind begin to understand, my mom died, I don't forget that now, I understand it, it's information, that's my life, and my body begins to regulate, there is a different level of stress that shows up to the physical system that's more historical. We just spent a lot of energy in that acute grief and surviving that acute grief. And so a dramatic example of that is that soldiers on a battlefield typically don't describe feeling a lot of fear or dread or panic. And after they come home and are safe, about a year after, their system starts to say, now we can feel these feelings. And remember that feelings are the words and the conscious thoughts about our emotions, which are these energetic currents. So if we are able to name and address, I know that this is sadness that's running through my system, I'm able to communicate it to you and maybe to a doctor, and maybe I may be able to keep my body from having a reaction that is so strong that it becomes ill. But I'll tell you, again, I think this is important. I have read all the things. I have treated all the people. I have a couple of master's degrees in this, and I've been doing it for 20 years. Both when my father died and when my mother died, I threw my back out completely. Like on my knees, laid out flat, days on end, muscle relaxers. And again, there may have been some wisdom in that pain, because laying flat and being still was probably better than the overfunctioning I was trying to do.
When is it important to be sure to get treatment from a trauma-informed therapist? And just, I think, getting that additional help and support for grief specifically.
Trauma is an event. The death of someone you love is a trauma. COVID has been a trauma. A car accident can be a trauma. A trauma can be your lacrosse coach yelling at you. What makes it, when it becomes that you have been traumatized, is that that energy from that event lands in your system and you are less than on account of it. You are now more afraid. You are less likely to take risk. It has left a tattoo or an imprint that is more negative than where you started. And a trauma-informed therapist is going to help you with the 5 senses experience of stuck energy. So remember that the energy that's inside our body, we translate that. And then we go and live our lives. So if I've had a terrible experience with a loss, and I am anxious and maybe really fearful, that experience of being anxious and fearful is predicting what I expect to have happen as we go forward in life. And my trauma is now turning into a traumatized life. And talk therapy doesn't typically shift that. It's actually experiencing in your body, your 5 senses, a sense of openness. And then that openness, we look towards the future. And suddenly there's possibility that wasn't there before. And there are trauma-related therapies. One of them is EMDR. It's eye movement. People are trained in this. And like hypnosis, it can work quickly for people. That's a trauma treatment I ask people to look at. Sensory motor psychotherapy and somatic experiencing. There are therapists out there that are trained in that, and it moves the energy through the body. There are modalities like IFS, internal family systems, which help people understand their responses to things. And there's a process called unburdening. Again, it's moving the energy through the body. So there is something, if people aren't sure whether or not they are experiencing trauma in their body and need treatment, you could go look at the ACEs quiz, which actually helps people understand if they are more predisposed to being traumatized. And I won't go into it, but it has to do with sort of what you went through in your childhood, and that we know that people who've had unsupported time in their childhood tend to be more prone to being traumatized by events that are difficult in later life. So that's Kaiser Permanente did that, and that study, and you can just go look it up, take the quiz, and if you score high, I would go see someone. There are some diagnostics out there. When do people have complicated grief? When do they? I'm not a huge fan of those labels. What I say to folks is, if it occurs to you that you might need some more help and support than is immediately available inside your family and friends system, that is enough. Go find a trauma-informed therapist, a grief-informed therapist, and talk to them about yourself.